Wow. So we've got some big challenges ahead of us, clearly. I'm going to try a little bit to bring home some of this to BC in terms of what this means to us in British Columbia, what has an impact on climate change and what we can do about it. So first slide, please. So I probably don't need to tell you this. Probably everybody in the room already knew that global warming was real. But when we think about climate change, we think about this. You know, this is such an emblematic image of climate change now that you can't look at a picture of a polar bear without thinking about climate change. But it's not something that's right in your backyard. It's not something that directly affects you personally, and it's not something that you necessarily feel really connected to. It might be something worth being concerned about, like endangered species issues, but it's not something that seems immediate and seems directly connected to you. So next slide, please. So what is it that we do understand and do really feel connected to? Well, you know, what we understand is ecosystems. You know, every kid in elementary school, like the one you saw in that picture there, learns about the hydrological cycles. They learn about where our water comes from. You know, you understand this basic concept that water evaporates, it turns into clouds, you have rain, and goes back into the ocean, and this is a cycle. All these things are connected into a big loop. And we understand food webs to a certain extent. This one's, you know, reasonably detailed, but you understand your connection as a human being to this web of life that we're all connected to. This is another thing that we're taught in school. We understand where our food comes from. We understand how we're connected to it. We understand it even when we're quite young. Next slide. Here it is simplified, just in case the last one didn't really make that much sense to you. So as you can see, there's a real clear connection here between the person and the environment. This is something we understand. But when it comes to climate science, we don't necessarily understand that. Where we need to get to is this. We need to understand the connection between ourselves and the rest of the planet. In the same way that we understand the connection between our food and ourselves, our water and ourselves, we need to understand that this Earth is actually a biosphere. That's a large ecosystem, just like that food web, just like that water cycle, where we are connected to the rest of the world. We need to understand that this pipeline, which is a pipeline that's being built in Alberta to expand the tar sands, and this, which is a farm in Delta, which is being paved to make way for a freeway to move more and more goods through our region, are connected to this, these polar bears. But not just those polar bears, they're also connected to this. Next slide, please. So this is flooding in China. And this is desertification of Darfur in Africa. That used to be a riverbed there, and it's now a desert. So who's responsible for all this? Now, I said that with this slide up for more than one reason, and there is some blame to be put on the shoulders of our political leaders, for sure, and definitely some in particular. But I actually put it up because of this next slide. We're all addicted to oil. George Bush said it. I mean, of all the people on earth to sort of say something that I think is fundamentally important for us to understand, you know, George Bush laid that out for us. And it's not just America that's addicted to oil, it's the whole planet. And I mean, from what we've understood, we need to reduce our dependence on fossil fuel. Not continue to ramp it up, not slow down the amount we ramp it up, but we need to stop where we are right now and start reducing immediately. Because we're addicted to oil, and it's making this planet sick. That same planet where we're all connected has become a biosphere that's actually ill. And that is a system that we're all connected to and depend on for our livelihood. So I'm going to say something relatively provocative here. This guy in Afghanistan, his livelihood and the economy of Afghanistan, to a large extent, depends on those poppies that you see growing around him. It's one of the #1 sources of economic development in the region. And it's something that we're quite concerned about, and I think most people think shouldn't be something that's okay. There might be some medicinal purposes for that product, but mostly it's used for this, which is unfortunate. And I'm sorry to show you a disturbing slide, but it's there for a reason. Because that addiction, as much as it's extremely harmful to the person who's sitting there, is not as severe as the addiction that we're part of. And I'll show you how. Next slide, please. That's the Athabasca tar sands. That's an open pit mine in Alberta, where this stuff is being extracted from the ground, the very same stuff that George Bush said we're addicted to. I'll show you on the next slide what it looks like. So that's bitumen. That's the stuff that comes out of the ground in the tar sands. It's buried under the boreal forest, and it's a source of major addiction. And we're, in Canada, a major supplier of this stuff to the rest of the world. They were unequivocal about it. They said we should have different conditions in Canada because the rest of the world depends on this area for their livelihood, and we require it for our livelihood. I think it's exactly the same as that guy in Afghanistan. And personally, I don't really see why we see that any differently than we see his relationship to that product. They're both dangerous substances that are easy to produce in that area, and we're profiting from them. This stuff is being extracted, and it turns into this. This is an upgrader, so this is where the stuff's taken processed before it's shipped out. You can see a ton of emissions coming out of there. But the problem isn't just the emissions that are released here in Canada. Often when people talk about the tar sands, they say, oh, it's only a small percentage of the emissions in Canada, and it's really not that big of a deal. But the problem isn't just that. Right here in BC, if you go to the next slide, there's a plan for what would be actually one of the biggest clear cuts in the history of our province to take from Alberta along this giant gateway pipeline, it's called, about a third of the oil that's being produced out of the tar sands to tankers in Kitimat, which would be then shipped to China and India and elsewhere. In economic terms, if we're not looking at the environment, there's a certain logic to this. I mean, we need to get off of our dependence on the American economy. 80% of our trade is with the United States. Perhaps we should diversify who we do trade with and all that stuff. But if you take a step back and you say, what does this have to do with getting a reduction of emissions by 80% by 2050? What does it have to do with getting a 25% reduction by 2020? What does it have to do with anything that has anything to do with anything other than making a whole bunch of money for big oil executives and some money for the Canadian economy, but making it in a way that I personally feel is unethical? So next slide, please. So this is what happens once it makes its way to Kitimat and elsewhere. I should point out that it's not just going to Kitimat, but these are the different routes that the tankers that would be loaded up with the fuel would actually head once they leave the port. They go in a variety of different directions, and if you love our coastline as much as I do, I think there's a lot of reason to be concerned about this, beyond just a simple concern for climate change. But there's also a lot of other related environmental concerns. That pipeline I showed you goes over about 1,000 salmon-bearing streams and rivers, and off our coast here, any one of these big tankers, which you'll see in the next slide. If any one of those ruptured, we could have something significantly worse than the Exxon Valdez right off of our coastline. And there's a reason why there's a moratorium on this kind of movement of oil in our coastline. It's really dangerous and has potentially really disastrous impacts on an area that's very biodiverse and very rich in life. And if this is the place that is going to be attractive and actually livable in the future, perhaps we should be a little bit smarter about the kind of danger we put in it. So next slide, please. So this is all part of a plan called the Gateway Project. The plan is our federal government's plan to expand our balance of trade with the Asia-Pacific region. So the pipeline I showed you is one part of it. That's the Gateway pipeline that ships goods, or that ships resources out to that part of the world. But there's also a whole bunch of goods heading the other direction, back towards North America. And they're coming on these big container ship ports, to our ports. And what's happening right here in BC, if you go to the next slide, as you can see, this is the plan for the Gateway Project in BC. And most people have heard about this part, which is where Highway 1 connects with Portman Bridge. Most people, when they hear about Gateway, they think about this connection between Surrey and Vancouver. And you, like I, have probably been stuck in traffic on the Portman Bridge and been frustrated. But what you're not hearing about is that it's actually about moving the goods through this newly expanded port in Delta, which they want to triple the capacity of, and then building this freeway, which you saw a picture of it being built in one of the earlier slides, that goes through some of our best farmland in Delta, cuts Burns Bog off from the Fraser River, which is sometimes called the lungs of the Lower Mainland, and then comes all the way along the banks of the Fraser and eventually hooks up with Highway 1 over here. All of this is about moving more and more goods through BC. And if you're worried about sustainable development, if you're worried about climate change, this is exactly the opposite of sustainable development. It's because of this. These are trucks currently lined up at Deltaport as we speak. Yeah, so just take that one in for a second. Every single one of these trucks is spewing emissions, and every single one of them is spewing toxins into the air, and they want to triple the number of those trucks. So this is a plan that will not just reduce congestion on the Portman Bridge, because you won't be idling as much. It's got nothing to do with that. It's about this. This is the Asia-Pacific Gateway Project, moving more and more goods through our region.